everybody. We're going to get started. We're so thankful to have our own Jim Landers here for us today, public budgeting and finance expert. He's going to be presenting, I believe, on a couple of projects, or at least a new project you're working on.
A new project.
Something that's relatively new. All right, cool. Well,
okay.
Take it away.
All right. Well, thanks. I appreciate being able to do this. I did this a couple of years ago on a corporate tax study, and I felt like the co-author and I got some good feedback. It really helped us in the second round after reviewers came back at us and made some changes. So it's really helpful. I'm hoping this will be helpful as well. This is research that I initially presented at the ABFM last fall, Association for Budgeting and Financial Management, for those of you who don't know what the acronym stands for. And I've made a lot of changes since then, but I need to probably make a lot more changes. So I'm interested to talk about this today. The issue, what I'm really talking about and researching, it really doesn't have anything to do with like the legal, like, is it good to have legal cannabis and all of that? It's really about the excise taxes and the revenue that states are getting from this, and looking at sort of the behavior of the revenues from a budgeting perspective. Okay. And it kind of ties back into a lot of the work I did in my previous life as a revenue forecaster and working on budgets. And so what I'm going to talk about is really important to budget planning and budgeting short-term and long-term by states. So today, I'll just quickly go through this to save time. I'm going to talk a little bit about cannabis excise taxes. Stephanie told me, you know, this is kind of a training moment, a teaching moment, so I'll do a little bit of that. I'll talk a little bit about the excise taxes, about some principles of taxation that are important to budgeting. Go through the research questions, which are pretty simple and straightforward. I'll talk a little bit about literature that goes to sort of modeling, measuring the models that are needed to measure long-run and short-run responsiveness of taxes. I'll talk a little bit about the estimating data and the models that I'm using, and then discuss these elasticity estimates that I get. And I'll have some conclusions and some next steps, which are pretty important, I think. So recreational cannabis sales, we've heard a lot about this nationally here in Ohio, since it started here about a year and a half ago or so in Ohio. There's about 23 states that now have legalized it and are regulating sales of recreational cannabis, and they're taxing it as well. It goes without question that they're going to tax it. Excise tax revenue in 2024 was about $3.2 billion nationally from these states, and the year-over-year growth rose from 23 to 24, 7.9% year over year in 24 for all the states that were taxing it at that time, 2.4% in 23, and I think that's kind of an indicator of these. Sort of what you have is you have some markets that have stabilized. They've been going for several years, so the market is stabilized, but you still have states that are coming online. So you have really high growth rates year over year initially as these markets sort of grow and evolve. So it's an interesting area. And I would say it's a lot like one of the areas that I used to study as an analyst in Indiana was the casino industry and casino revenues and casino taxation. And it was sort of the same thing. It's highly regulated markets, lots of fast growth, and then this sort of product life cycle that happens where it stabilizes and then maybe even declines to some extent. So we'll see what happens here. The study I'm focusing on is 5 states in the West. They tend to have longer time series that I can use, especially Colorado, Washington, and Oregon. And so I'm looking at those 5 states, and I'm looking at them right now separately, but I have some ideas about doing some panel analysis as well moving forward. As far as the taxes, first of all, what's an excise tax? So an excise tax, it's a consumption tax that's imposed or it's levied on a particular product, particular activity, a particular service, okay? Or a small, very limited group of products or services. And the sort of the traditional ones I would throw out as examples like cigarette tax, cigarette and tobacco products, alcohol beverage excise taxes, gasoline excise tax. Those are all excise taxes. Two types of excise taxes that you can have. One is an ad valorem tax, where the tax is a percentage of the value of the transaction. It's the percentage of the price, like the retail sales tax, where it's just a percentage of the sale value. So most of the cannabis excise taxes are ad valorem taxes, okay? And most of them are levied at retail, at final sale. There's a couple states that have wholesale taxes. Colorado is actually one of them, that are ad valorem taxes, okay? The other kind of excise tax is a specific or a unit tax or a volume tax, like the gasoline tax, dollars per gallon or something like that. There's a few states that have those. They're either sort of a tax based on the weight of the product that's being sold, like, you know, pounds of flour or bud or leaves or something like that, or it's based on the THC content. There's a couple of states that have that as well. What we're looking at with these states out west is ad valorem excise taxes, predominantly. And there's a myriad uses. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because I really haven't gotten to that point. I'm really focusing on the revenue side. But the issue here is, like, are the revenues growing and stable so they can fund the stuff that these taxes are earmarked for? Okay, a lot of this tax revenue is earmarked for specific uses like social equity and justice reinvestment programs. Sometimes it's school aid, sometimes it's drug treatment and addiction services. There's sort of a variety of uses that these taxes have been earmarked for or specified for. As far as what's happening in these states, the tax rates kind of vary, okay? The highest being Washington with a rate of 37%. Colorado, it's probably somewhere, effectively, it's probably somewhere the state tax between the 20, 25, 30%. There's a 15% wholesale tax and a 15% retail tax. Depends, you know, whether it gets up close to 30% just really depends on the markup from wholesale to retail. Some of the states allow locals, counties, cities to impose as well their own excise taxes on cannabis that's sold within those counties or cities. Some of the states also, they lard on the retail sales tax as well onto those sales. So I think estimates I've seen, some of these states, the taxes are probably between 40 and 50% of the retail price or cost is tax, okay? So it becomes something, and I'm not going to get, this is a discussion for another day. There is lots of discussion, as with the casino taxes in a lot of states, that they become really confiscatory taxes. They're just taking so much of the income from the sellers that it potentially becomes hard to even operate a business like that. So I'm going to focus on 5 of these states. Hopefully in the future I can do some modeling to include the other 3, Arizona, New Mexico, and Montana, but they've come on so recently that the time series are just too short to do anything with a regression model, let's put it that way. Yeah.
What is Ohio requiring, or what is our tax right now?
Our tax is an ad valorem tax at retail. Okay. I don't know what it is offhand. I've kind of focused on these, but it is I think it might be 15 or 20%. Is it 20? Yeah, and I think the legislature every so often talks about increasing it to some extent. So, and I think one of the other things, and I may be getting ahead of myself on the slides, is it's just not the taxes, there's this whole regulatory scheme, and they vary from state to state. For instance, here in Ohio, you can grow your own. And so, and some states don't allow that. You have to buy it from a retailer. Whereas if you could grow your own legally, and it's a limited amount that you can grow, but that would cut into sales from retailers. So these regulatory schemes can also kind of affect sales across states, probably affect the competitiveness between states and all of that. So that becomes important as well. As far as just year over year, you can kind of see here the markets that have been around the longest, Colorado, Washington, and Oregon, they're in periods right now where they're kind of seeing declines year over year. They kind of flattened out, and you can see this sort of variability year to year where they might grow a little bit, next year they might decline a little bit. Whereas New Mexico and Montana in particular, they're so new, they're getting really significant growth rates year over year. So revenue principles for budgeting, okay? You open up Fisher's book on state and local government finance, and all the economists, there's like 3 principles of taxation they love to talk about all the time. There's, what is it? Well, now I'm blanking. Efficiency, equity, and incidence. Love to talk about that. We're not going to talk about those. Okay. When it comes to budgeting, and this goes back to sitting with John Meisel in revenue forecast meetings, he would always hammer these points home. We have to worry about the adequacy of taxes and the elasticity of taxes and the volatility or the stability. These are really important principles for budgeting when it comes to revenue sources. Revenue adequacy is really, in the short run and the long run, is a tax going to provide sufficient revenue to pay for the cost of the services it's supposed to pay for? And the extra step is at reasonable tax rates, okay? Not super high confiscatory rates or ridiculous rates or unpredictable rates, but at reasonable rates over time that are relatively stable. Is it going to pay for the services that we want it to pay for? Is the revenue responsive? Is it elastic? Is it going to grow with the economy? If we're looking at a state, is it going to grow with the factors that sort of increase demand for services like population growth, like economic growth, like GDP, like income growth, okay? Is it also going to grow enough to provide enough revenue, growth in revenue that covers just the growth in cost of providing services, aside from just expanding services, okay? Because there's inflation that revenues have to account for as well when it comes to the cost of services. The third one is revenue stability, okay? And this is really important in the short run. We want revenues to be consistent and predictable over time, but in particular in the short run, we don't want them to fluctuate a lot. And that's the problem. With the federal government, those guys can just spend like drunken sailors, and when we go into a recession, it doesn't matter. They're debt financing operating spending even when we're growing. So when they go into recession, they just take out more debt so they can continue to spend. State and local governments can't do that. So they have to be able to have state taxes that are not subject to so much volatility that there's significant declines in revenue when we go into an economic downturn, when spending either has to stay at a level, at some reasonable level, or it might grow, okay? So that's an important facet of budgeting, short-term as well as long-term, in terms of planning for the next 3 or 4 years of a budget. Everybody follow? Okay, good. I don't want to over-explain. A couple other principles, and these really go to the measures that I'm trying to estimate. And I talked about elasticity, that's sort of broad strokes. This is actually the specific measure that I'm trying to get with this modeling. Tax elasticity is basically the built-in responsiveness, the organic growth, the organic responsiveness of a tax to changes in the economy. Without any changes, policy changes, no tax rate changes. So we're holding tax rates and the tax base constant. How does the tax base, how does its revenue respond to the economy? That's really important. And that's really important for budgeting and revenue forecasting, because we can't, if we're forecasting revenue and planning a budget for the next 2 years, the policymakers and the staff really you can't plan for, oh, well, we'll raise tax rates, or we'll do something to the tax base to get more revenue. What we have to plan for is, what's the growth separate and apart from that? Okay, what's the growth that we're going to get over the next 2 or 3 years in the revenue? So that's why tax elasticity is really important. It's a really important measure for budgeting and forecasting. Buoyancy is this other measure. I've never kind of wrapped my head around why this is anything, frankly. It's a thing, but I don't really think it's that great. It's a measure of the responsiveness of revenues or the tax base, but it's inclusive of all these policy changes as well. So it doesn't separate out the impact of policy change from the impact of its response to income growth or GDP growth or something like that. And so there, I'm not really sure. I've never been crazy about that measure. But what I'm really aiming for is I want a good estimate of tax elasticity, the elasticity of the base, the organic change in the base responding to change in the economy. So the research question is pretty straightforward. One, what's the long-run growth potential, i.e., what's the long-run income elasticity of cannabis tax revenue? Second one is, how volatile is it? Okay, what's the short-run income elasticity of cannabis tax revenues? Okay, so I want to know that long-run growth potential, but I also want to know that short-run volatility, that fluctuation that may occur when there's, in particular, when there's an economic downturn. But generally, what's the fluctuation with the business cycle? Okay, and then there's a couple other questions that go along with that. One is just, frankly, what's the variation between states and these measures? And I think there it's not just like, well, there's variation, but then, well, why? Why are these things varying from state to state? Okay, and it's important to know that. And then the second one is, how do they vary from other state taxes? Okay, and then maybe the question is why? Okay, and there are these measures for certain other state taxes, and so I've done some comparisons in the slide presentation of that, of the elasticity measures I get for cannabis taxes to some other state taxes. And there's reasons why there's variation, and I'll talk about that when I get to it. So a little bit of literature, where would we be without this? This is an old article, but it's really sort of a seminal piece of research, very rudimentary, but it really got things started in terms of like, let's start looking at these elasticity measures and this responsiveness of state tax revenue to economic change. So Groves and Kahn, they specified this log-log model and said, hey, this is the way you model and estimate long-run and short-run income elasticity of tax base, okay? And they came up with elasticity measures, and they concluded that B1 or beta 1 is both the long-run and the short-run income elasticity. So I assumed that they were symmetric, rather, okay? There's a caveat to what I say on here. So they measured tax elasticity to some extent. They didn't specifically control for like rate changes in their model. They didn't control for like tax-based changes in their model over time. But what they did was they looked at states where there had been sort of no significant legislative changes over time. So to a great extent, they were measuring tax elasticity, hopefully. Maybe these are buoyancy measures more so, but I think they're probably more elasticity measures than anything. So that was a good start, all right? The problem is short run and long run are not symmetric. They are different, and they have to be modeled differently. And so the really seminal study was by Sobel and Holcomb in 1996, and they looked at what Groves and Kahn had done, and they said, first off, one thing was they demonstrate that no, okay, you cannot model the short run income elasticity with that log-log model with levels data. Okay, it's not going to work. That's the long-run elasticity, and that's all it is. You have to use this log change model or a first difference model to do the short-run elasticity. So ultimately, then they come up with, we have to do two models. One is the top is the long-run model, the bottom is the short-run. Then they do some other statistical gymnastics, if you will. I don't know how much I want to get into that, but one of the things they do in blue on the top is they demonstrate that there are certain problems with let me put it this way. They suggest using a dynamic OLS model, okay, to estimate the long-run elasticity so that it is not biased. Right? And the reason they do this is because they demonstrate and they determine that one, sort of these short-run income dynamics that occur in the long run and in the long-run equation, ultimately the income variable ends up being correlated with the error term. I guess it creates some endogenous issues. And then there's autocorrelation. And so this dynamic OLS model controls for that so that you get an unbiased estimate of the long-run income elasticity. They also go through a lot of discussion about stationarity of time series data, co-integration of the levels variable, and testing for that. I'm not going to jump into that pool at this point. But there's a lot of work that they require for that model to work right and to give you an unbiased estimate of the long-run income elasticity. It's really good work, okay? And it's stuff that I'm doing, okay, in my study. The second thing they do is not only do they say, okay, in the short run, to do this short-run elasticity, you have to use a log change model. They suggest using what's called an error correction model. Okay. And so in blue, B3 times the error term from the first stage equation lagged one period is what's called the error correction term, or the adjustment, in this case, the adjustment to trend parameter. Okay. What this does is it yields an unbiased estimate of the short-run income elasticity, because if we don't have the error correction term, we basically have an estimate of the elasticity which includes not just short-run fluctuation because of the business cycle, which is what we want to know, but it also includes sort of this variation naturally of the tax base above and below trend over time, and its return to trend, okay? And so we want to separate those out, and that's what this does. So we get a separate income elasticity, a short-run income elasticity, and then we get something that tells us basically the speed of adjustment of the tax base when it's above the trend, long-run trend, or below the trend, back to trend, okay? Which is, if you look at tax base or tax revenue data over time, you'll see you can project a trend through the data, or an estimate the trend through the data, which is a straight line, but the data actually goes up and down, above, below the trend, and what that error correction term is measuring is how much of that return to trend happens each period of time. In this case, each quarter. Okay, because we're looking at quarterly data. Everybody follow that? Okay, and the error correction term specifically is simply the errors from the first stage equation lagged by one period. Questions about that? I think I've explained that well. Not over-explained it, okay? All right, so then a couple other studies that are important here. One is a study by Don Bruce and Bill Fox down at Tennessee and Tuttle, where they do some additional things to the error correction model. And so what they wanted to do was say, okay, we'd like to know the adjustment to trend parameter and the short run income elasticity. But we'd like to know what they are. We'd like to know something about whether they're asymmetric, depending upon whether tax base is above trend or tax base is below trend. So what's the response? Are they different depending upon where the tax base is relative to trend, right? And I've got typos on that. That should be the change in the log of sales, the change in the log of income, yada, yada, yada. The dummy variable there is just simply, it's equal to 1. If the error term in the first stage is above trend, is greater than 0, and ultimately the base is above trend, and it's 0 if it's below trend, or it's 0 if the error term is negative. Okay. And then we interact it with income, or the change in income, and we interact it with the error term, or with the error correction term, sorry. So last study, Nichols and Tosin, they actually use everything that Sobel and Holcomb and Bruce, Fox, and Tuttle have suggested or used, but they apply it to an excise tax. Okay, so Bruce, Fox, and Tuttle actually they use this to analyze state sales and state income taxes. Okay, and different than Sobel and Holcomb. Sobel and Holcomb, they do this great modeling, but the data they use is kind of crappy. Okay, frankly, it's all proxies for state and local tax bases or state tax bases, and they don't adjust. They don't account for like rate changes, or base changes over time. But the modeling they do is really great, and the way they demonstrate it is really great. Bruce, Fox, and Tuttle actually use actual sales and state sales and state income tax revenue. They get it from the Department of Census or the Bureau of the Census. It's the Census of Government Finance data. It's quarterly. And they adjust for rates, rate changes, and some really big base changes. They do the adjustment for rates by just simply, their dependent variable is what we call the implied tax base. It's take the revenues divided by the tax rate, you get back to sort of an estimate, if you will, of the tax base. So that way is how they control for rate variation over time. And then they have dummy variables in particular that account for major base changes, like a dummy if a state adopts a grocery exemption on the sales tax, or if they have some kind of different way of taxing capital gains on the income tax or something like that. It would change the tax base systematically. So they do that, and then they change the modeling of the error correction model in an interesting way. Nichols and Tosin, the thing that's good about it, the thing that I like about theirs, one, it was a casino revenue study, so I dug that. Another thing is it's an excise tax. So it's an excise tax like the cannabis excise tax as well. It's not a general tax like the sales tax on lots of product and some services, or an income tax on all personal income. So it's a little different, okay? It's narrower, and it's probably subject to some of the same things in terms of regulatory regimes and things, or variations in regulatory regimes that an excise tax on cannabis would be. So it's a little more comparable, I guess. The thing I don't like about their study is, one, they don't control for rate changes over time, which there were rate changes over time in some, especially in the Midwestern states on the riverboat casinos. They don't control for the casino admissions taxes. So the casino tax is a gross receipts tax. It's a percentage of whatever the take is for the casino, called the win percentage, if you will. It's what they keep, all right? Well, rate changes are going to affect that. They didn't control for that. And I'm not here to bag on that, but I think it's a limit of the research that I'm thinking about when I'm looking at cannabis taxes. Some of the Midwestern casinos have to pay admissions taxes. When you walk in, they have to pay $3 or $4 to the state. That could affect the gross And then they didn't adjust for prices, or they didn't account for prices. The win percentage is going to vary from one casino to another, from state to state. Over time, it's going to vary. The win percentage on slot machines can be adjusted. Okay, the win percentage on poker, like what's the hold for the house, that ain't changing. It's fixed. Okay, it is what it is. But that might be 15 or 20% of the revenue. 80% is electronic devices, slot machines, and they can alter that. They can change the win percentage, the price that's paid. So those are problematic, and that kind of has informed like what I'm thinking of doing with the modeling I'm doing. So I think they overall, they do a good job of controlling for supply factors because it's a regulated market, but they kind of fall short on some of these policy changes, if you will, in my opinion, okay? And if I ever see Mehmet Tosin somewhere, that's his name, I'll bring that up to him. I tried to reach out to them when I started doing this, like, why didn't you control for those? And I didn't really get great answers for them. So it's been a long time ago, so I think they were just like, I can't even remember what we were doing. So, all right, enough of that. So my modeling, a lot of stuff, okay? Cannabis sales are going to be impacted by a lot of different factors. The factor I'm most interested in is personal income. How does variation in personal income affect cannabis sales, which is the tax base for the excise tax? But there's all these other factors. Price, okay? Price obviously is going to affect sales. Excise tax could affect sales directly. Also, it could affect it through the price, okay? Input prices could affect price, again, affecting cannabis sales. The run-up in retailers, the number of retailers in every state tends to flatten out at some point. I mean, it's not going to continue to increase over time forever, but there is sort of a significant increase initially, and then it kind of stabilizes. So there is an impact on sales because of additional retailers coming online over time. And that's kind of a regulatory regime that varies from states. Some of the states, Colorado, Washington, tended to have a pretty significant growth early on, but there was growth over time in retailers. California was like, boom. They got retailers up and going really fast. So all of a sudden, within a couple of quarters, they had a huge number of retailers. So that can kind of affect the initial months or the initial quarters of performance. Kind of something I need to do a better job of controlling for. And then there's this whole product life cycle, that you have this initial high growth period, things kind of level out after the initial period where there's a run up in retailers and all of that, and supply, and the novelty effect. And then it flattens out, and you may have these periods where there's a little bit of growth or a little bit of decline moving forward. The data for all these states tends to, it flattens out, and then there's kind of a decline period after that. It's not flat. It's not returning to some of those earlier quarters.
Stop me if you're going there, but when you say retailers, independent or total count of stores?
The total count, the count by quarter.
So I mean, there's transparency on ownership.
Yeah, there tends to be pretty good retailer data for each state in terms of the licenses, because they have to have a certificate or a license from the state. And so those retailer counts, it's a lot of data and a lot of working with the data, but you can come up with a pretty good count each quarter for the number of retailers that are out there. Yeah.
And then that's also spatial, right? Is it all done at a state level?
Sure, you could do this at, like, just take one state and study it in terms of that. Yeah. So that could be done as well. I've thought about that, but
Near the effect of Idaho, right?
Yeah, yeah.
near the borders.
That's right. And that's something I've got to work with. And I'll talk about that after a while. The price data is problematic, okay? Prices are problematic. One state, California, actually publishes retail prices. It's not a complete data set, which is problematic over time. But the other states, there aren't prices. There's no price data published by the state. Some states have sort of I think Colorado is one where they have a wholesale price, which is sort of a synthetic price that's being set by the state for the wholesale tax. Not good. You'd have to, I mean, I wouldn't use that. So what I'll talk about it now with some of these things I've had to work with. So the price, what I try to do modeling that is, I don't have a retail price, so I'm using some input prices as a proxy. Electric price. A lot of these people are growing in greenhouses and they're using LED lights and stuff, so electricity is like a significant input, which is going to flow through to their pricing. So I'm looking at using that as a proxy, variation in electric price for variation in retail price. Another one is fertilizer price. So the electric prices are state level from the EIA well, okay, easy. Right. Easy. But, so those are state level pricing per kilowatt hour, commercial electric prices. And then I'm using like a fertilizer, it's a PPI, national PPI for fertilizer. So again, variation in that, creating variation, proxying for variation in retail price. Retailers, I've got good data. Excise tax, the nice thing is there haven't been a lot of tax changes over time, so I can kind of just assume that one away, I guess. And then product life cycle, I think that results in like dummy variables. And then it's just determining where there's like a break point, which I gotta work on that. Some methodology for figuring out the break point, at least in the startup period, to get that, to account for that. I think that's it. So, and these are the models I'm using. So I've got retailers, fertilizer price, electric price. There's a little typo on the electric price in the top model. The fertilizer and electric prices are lagged by 4 quarters. Controlling there for growing season and getting product basically to retailers. I control for quarters. It's quarterly data, so I have quarterly dummies for Q2, Q3, and Q4 every year. There's a dummy for border sales. So I know that's rudimentary. It's kind of brute force, but that's what I use this time around. It's basically 1. It's 0 if there's no border state that's selling cannabis. It's 1 once they turn it on. Let's see what else is there. Retailers, here's the problem with the retailers, okay? Collinearity issues with income. I mean, you got retailers rising, income's rising. It creates, it's highly correlated. So what I did here was I pulled a trick out of the forecasting hat, all right? I did what we call I residualized retailers. Okay, I ran a regression where retailers is the dependent variable, and I have income on the other side, and I use the errors from that equation. I use the errors as a sort of a synthetic retailer variable, if you will. And that is supposed to, 1, eliminate the collinearity, and also sort of give you a separate effect of income, and then this sort of additional effect of added retailers. Now, if I sent that to a journal, I don't know what anybody would say, but I'm running with it until they tell me no, okay? Because I gotta have a retailer, I gotta have something in there for retailers. The error correction model is just the first differences with the error correction term and the short-term income elasticity, and then I went ahead and I did the Bruce Fox and Tuttle augmented error correction model to see where that would go. And here are my results, okay? There's 3 slides towards the end of the presentation. I'm happy to send it to everybody who wants to see it, that show like all of the model results for each of these. I didn't want to throw all that up here. I really wanted to focus on the elasticity measures because I'm going to run out of time. So, broad strokes, the long-run income elasticities are kind of high, okay, especially for Colorado and Washington. And I think I mean, these should be like, you know, something between 1 and 2, fine, but, whoa, 3.5 or 3.6, that's high, okay? And so I think this is where I need to really kind of start thinking about controlling, especially for the startup period. And I don't want to throw those observations out and start 6 quarters in. I want to keep them in the data set, but I think it's a dummy variable that I need to have in there to control for that impact, and then maybe interacting it with income or something like that to control for this. As far as the short run elasticities, those should be, I would assume those would be higher, okay? Typically the long run elasticities are lower than the short run. The short run shows all this fluctuation. So those don't strike me as being terrible, but in comparison to what you see below, top half are my estimates, bottom half are estimates from the literature. I think that because this is an ad valorem tax, the best, and it's an excise tax, really the best comparisons are either sales tax or the casino tax estimates from other literature. Alcohol, beverage, and cigarette taxes, those, as I said earlier, they're specific, they're unit taxes, and they're not going to respond to income changes the same way as an ad valorem tax is. It just doesn't happen, okay? So they're still high in both cases comparatively, so I'll just focus on, I'll get you, Neil, let me just go through. So the short run elasticities, I don't see those may be high. I'm not really convinced that they are. I think that the long run are high, and there needs to be some better modeling to sort of tease out the real income elasticity where it is. The interesting thing is that short run elasticity overall is all coming from when revenues are above trend. Okay, because when you look at the short run elasticity, when tax base is above trend, that's where you've got these really high short run elasticities. When it's below trend, it's basically no response. Okay, they're not significant, they're very small, they're zero. Okay, statistically. And then adjustment to trend, there's not much there that's statistically significant. Again, above trend, it appears that the responsiveness there, or basically the correction back to trend is a lot higher, or is a lot more robust when tax base is above trend. When it's below trend, I think part of the reason is we haven't had a lot of time where revenues are running for any period of time below trend. It's a lot of volatility above trend, and in particular the early quarters of the market growth. Neil, you had.
I was just wondering about demographics, you go quarterly.
But
I didn't know enough about consumption patterns.
yeah, I don't know what to do about demographics. I mean, I think, you know, maybe one thing, if I was doing this on a national, like all the states in the U.S., I mean, I've got this region, and I know these states are not all the same, but I think if I was doing something with all 26 states or 23 states, one demographic variable would just be age. It would be, you know, percentage of the population 30 and below, or 35 and below, or something like that. So I agree that it's probably something I should try, even with these states. Yeah. No.
Do you have differences in the price elasticity of demand in these states?
No, I don't.
It's inversely related to the long run elasticity here, right? So, do you have any reason to believe that demographics would contribute to a different PED?
Well, I don't know. So in terms of, I mean, these are the income elasticities. They should be, we would assume they'd be positive. More income, more spending, right?
Yeah.
The fertilizer, if you go look at the detailed modeling, the fertilizer price and electricity price variables, or the coefficients, they are negative. So they have they're intuitive. They're not, always statistically significant, but they are negative. Is that kind of what you?
Between the states, though, are they different in terms of their elasticities on the demand side?
Yeah, they are. I mean, well, I don't know because I don't have measures of that. Those price elasticities are.
Because that's the only way I can see demographic factors factoring into this.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
If it would change the demand. I don't know where you're going. Explain. Elaborate.
If the demand curve was more vertical in one state versus another, it would be driven by demographic differences.
Okay.
Income effects would wash out of the model. The income effect wouldn't be what's driving it. It'd be driving it through the elasticity of demand, which is inversely related to the long run tax elasticity. Right.
So,
Presuming that the market structure is equivalent in all states. There's also supply effects.
Well, I'm saying that the markets, yes, and assuming that the potency is the same in the states.
Yeah, quality issues in the market.
There's not gummies that are sold instead of other products. Lots of other factors.
And some of these are pretty thin markets as well, right?
that's another, I mean,
Yeah.
it is the products, the differentiation of products is pretty significant, and the pricing is pretty significant. The differentiation. I mean, that is a problem. Trying to.
So they're different demand curves entirely.
Yeah. I mean, you've got gummies, you've got bud.
Right.
Some of the bud is sold for all the other, the extracts and stuff. Some of the bud is sold just to smoke. You got leaves. It is a very differentiated group of products. So taking this aggregate sales number, and I understand the limits of that. That's a problem. That's a problem even with the pricing variable.
Yeah, it's complex, but okay. But my larger point was demographics I'm not so concerned about as much as I am about the demand curve.
We can talk a little bit.
Sure.
I'd like to know how I can deal with that, or if I can't.
I don't know that there's any measures of it.
Okay.
Getting accurate elasticity measures is a challenge in any modeling endeavor.
Yeah.
So you can proxy it, but we just don't know what the demand for the.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that that's been a question that anybody's asked about, like casino stuff.
Really?
I don't think I've ever heard anybody ask about that when it came to estimating these elasticities for casino taxes. And if you go from state to state, the demand for that is much different. I mean, there are cultural differences, there's simply raw economic differences that change the demand for gaming from one state to another. It's a good question.
Yeah.
Or a good point. Okay, all right, I get it. I'll talk to you some more.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I'm running out of time. I don't think I need to say more about this. The results, this was just kind of a little interesting, looking at growth rates, kind of shows you, I think, you know, the growth, high growth rates to stability to actually decline. And here's what I found to be the important part of looking at this is COVID. Okay, another variable that maybe another control that I need in the model. Okay, tons of stimulus during COVID. These were assumed to be necessary businesses, essential businesses in all these states. They didn't close, okay? They were open. And what's interesting is you see these sort of bump up in the growth rates, especially in the quarterly data, except for Nevada. Why? Tourism, okay? It killed their tourism business. So they actually saw muted growth rates or declines when everybody else saw a real spike in growth. And then what happened? It didn't just level off, it declined after that, okay? So that's another one where kind of a need to control for that, I think. The prior models have been so simplistic that when I started this, I was like, oh, I can just do some simple modeling and bam, I'll have answers. Well, now these, you know, I'm getting to where there's lots of controls that I'm having to add or I think I need to add. And now Noah has just thrown a total wrench in the works. Thank you.
Are your quarter controls that you have just like quarter of the year, like we know in January for Q1 it's different than Q4, or is it you're not doing Q1 2020, Q1 22? Because you could just use the actual.
Yeah, it's just a quarter. It's a quarter.
Oh, you're not lumping the states together though, so you can't.
No,
Got it. You'd have to lump the states together to control for.
Yeah, it's just quarterly, Q2, Q3, Q4.
Yeah, for seasonal stuff
That's
rather
right.
than
It's
macro
the
stuff.
control for the seasonality, correct. So conclusions, long run elasticities are large, statistically significant. I think they need work. Short run elasticities are small and inconsistent. And, you know, indicating limited sensitivity, especially when tax base is below trend. The tax base adjusts back to the long run trend, but it's different speeds across states. And understand the way you interpret this is when it says, you know, for instance, Colorado, above trend, the adjustment to trend is negative 0.334. It's the way to interpret that is about a third of the adjustment back to trend happens each quarter. Okay, so after 3 quarters or 4, it's adjusting back to trend. Okay, so cannabis tax adjusts back to long run trend, different speeds, supply cost, I guess demand, and regulatory factors matter. It's a lot of thought about controls, continuing that. Current models identify growth and stability, but improved specifications are needed. To fully assess what I was interested in was sustainability. And so next steps, I have to look at better developing this sort of border effects issue, especially when sales start in a bordering state. And that varies. I mean, some of these states like Nevada coming on, or California, Nevada, a lot of the border there, it's out in the middle of nowhere, you know, or Arizona and California. A lot of it's out in the middle of nowhere. Oregon and Washington, though, you got Portland on one side of the Columbia River and you got Vancouver on the other side. So that's a big deal, okay? So I got a better control for that. I got a control for sort of this product life cycle, or try to at least, or part of it. Pricing data, there are private vendors that have pricing data. I don't know how good it is, but it costs money. I don't want to spend money. I think I'm going to estimate some panel levels, okay? Just in part so I can throw New Mexico and Montana and Arizona in there as well and do some other controls. So, and you're
Maybe macro trends too.
Yeah, that's right. And then it's developing this revenue sustainability framework. And what I envision is, once I get a good error correction model, is actually doing some projections using different economic scenarios with the error correction model, and see where the revenue goes, or the projected revenue goes moving forward, as sort of a discussion item for discussion of, sustainability and volatility over time. That's it. And there are some, this afterwards. I'll send it to you.
So, give me the title of the paper there about how addictive it is for state financing. Is there any evidence that casino,
Yeah, I mean,
casinos ever shut down? You got all entrance stuff, is there exit?
is there,
Casino?
no.
Yeah, right.
I mean, there's
Hence the
continual
addiction
expansion.
aspect of it, right?
I mean, that's the problem, is that these kinds of taxes, sin taxes, if you will, are easy gets for policymakers, because it's like it's bad stuff. Cigarettes.
But some of the other sin taxes have been ethereal, right? Soda taxes have come and gone,
Sure, yeah.
right?
Cigarette tax is the classic one, though. Cigarette tax always was a nice revenue handle for legislatures. They'd raise the tax 3-4 cents a pack because they needed some additional revenue. Because remember, budgeting's not about the base. Budgeting's about growth. So you're really operating, when you're making a budget, about the revenue growth moving forward. So we need a little extra revenue, raise the cigarette tax, and as the percentage of the population that smoked declined, it was an easy revenue handle, because who cares about those people that smoke, We don't care that it's a regressive tax. It's not our pride. And so casino taxes, the same thing. Cannabis taxes, same thing. It's an easy revenue handle. What did the DeWine administration do in the last budget? They pushed a bunch of increases in sin taxes to get more revenue. So it's an easy revenue handle. And the problem is that they think they're going to get continual growth, which is what they thought in the casinos in Indiana. But then once you have Ohio, and once you have Native American casinos that don't pay any taxes for the most part, setting up shop across the border in Southwest Michigan, now all of a sudden, our revenues are declining. They're not just stabilized from all that competition. So it becomes a real problem budget-wise, yeah.
I guess I'm wondering, and sorry, I know it's time, what kind of role the medical or insurance industry plays in this? Is that completely separated from the retail? Because nobody prescribes cigarettes, and nobody prescribes alcohol, so then it's harder to hold them up, at least not anymore. They don't prescribe alcohol for illness. You know what I mean? Like, where does that fit in?
I don't know. I mean, I think as far as that, I think it's in its infancy. There's still a lot of discussion about, like, the health, is that what you're talking about, the health effects
The
of cannabis?
medicinal marijuana prescriptions, and then the
They would be
effect-
taxed too, right? Would they be? Like
But then,
medicinal?
what does
Yeah.
how does insurance
Or are
play
they
into
not?
that? Yeah.
If they're not taxed,
Oh,
I don't know.
I don't. So medicinal marijuana tends not to be taxed
Okay,
by these excise
so
taxes.
if more people could get a prescription, maybe your demand then would go down back to the.
Skirting the tax, yeah.
Yeah, if you can go do that, yeah, sure. And I think most of these states, the problem has been sort of twofold. One is there's a glut in supply, which has caused prices to decline, and you can't, as a grower in like California, you can't sell to other states, so you're sort of stuck. That's a problem. And the other problem is these states, California is like the poster child. They larded so much regulation on this and cost, and then the high taxes. It's a problem for people to make it never did away with the black market. So they're competing. It's like they're competing on a price they have to set up here because of all the regulation, which some of it is for good reason. If you want it to be safe to ingest or smoke, And the taxes, the pricing's up here, but the black market's still down here, and people are like, screw it, I'll buy from the illegal dealer instead of from the legal places. That's another problem. I mean, casino gambling never did away with illegal gambling. It still exists because, you know, it just, part of it is just pricing. Yeah.
I'm wondering, in those 5 states, how many of the dispensaries or the companies are Section 17?
What's that?
Tribally owned, tax-free.
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question.
Because I can imagine a lot of the desert communities in California, you know, basically the eastern part of the state, all of the Palm Springs area.
That's possible. That's something actually to look into.
Yeah.
This being, you know, tribal areas, no tax on cigarettes. No, there's no tax on cigarettes, casino gaming, gasoline, alcohol or anything. And in the old days, you used to have, it was only if you were a member of the tribe, you could buy tax-free, but then it just, you know, it was never enforced. So you just go on the reservation or the tribal lands and buy cigarettes tax-free and everything. So I don't know. That's an interesting question.
Related question. Ohio has very strict banking rules on dispensaries, so that, because it's a cash business, so that there's reporting, right?
Yeah.
Do the other states have similar?
I'm not sure about the bank. I mean,
Because there's only one bank in the state of Ohio that dispensaries can use. It has to be Right Pac Credit Union. They're the only registered bank that will deal with their business because of all the regs.
is that a federal credit union too?
I don't know. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think it exists in
Yeah,
California.
state, it's got to be state credit.
So, but because Ohio has very strict rules, it's a cash business, you want to make sure they're not, you know, under reporting.
Sure.
So, any question? Yeah.
I don't know. I think that, I mean, the broad strokes are, I think we could go down all these rabbit holes.
Yeah, it's a complex
And then
research question.
it becomes how much is that going to change the estimates ultimately?
No, I just want to say how much
But
I
it-
applaud you. You're studying something that's hard.
Yeah, well,
This is cool.
But somebody's got to do it, so.
And that's the way I
yeah.
look at it. I spend so much time like these rabbit holes, and then I'm like, wow, how much is this going to change my elasticity estimate, you know?
Right.
But I want to make it where I don't get like tons of questions, like, hey, you haven't controlled for this. Well,
On the
Hell's bells,
you're
I tried,
advancing science,
you know.
forget that. Yeah.
yeah. So it's an interesting area. I mean, I think the whole area in terms of like, again, not to bag on California, my wife is actually listening to us online, and she'll kill me. She's a Californian. Is this whole idea that it's like, hey, we're going to do away with the illegal market by doing this, but then ultimately the legislature, the policymakers get a hold of it, and they want to tax it, and there's all this additional stuff they want people to do, and ultimately it's just kind of unrealistic that that's going to happen. And you know, and the price elasticities are just way higher than probably anybody expected. I mean, LAO out in California, originally they completely overestimated the revenue that was going to come in from cannabis taxes there. And when I looked at it after the fact, I thought, God, did you guys think about price elasticity at all? You know, I mean, you guys, all the cost and everything.
That's my point.
Yeah, that's right. Well,
Good,
thanks for
nice job.